Welcome back to Starz Recapped, the channel where we break down the world's most gripping films in the most thrilling way. Today, we dive into Nuremberg 2025, a tense, emotionally charged courtroom drama that revisits one of the darkest chapters of history. In this film, justice collides with humanity as the architects of a global nightmare are brought face to face with their crimes. Secrets unfold, loyalties are tested, and the world watches in shock as the truth is dragged into the light. So tighten your seatbelts, because this story isn't just about a trial. It's about the weight of justice, the cost of truth, and the courage it takes to stand against unimaginable evil. Let's break down the film scene by scene. This is Nuremberg 2025, explained by Starz Recapped. The year is May 1945, and the final echoes of World War II are fading. Along a quiet European road, a squad of American soldiers escorts a group of civilians to safety. Everything seems calm, until a lone vehicle bearing the Nazi insignia pushes straight through the crowd. The soldiers instantly raise their weapons, bracing for the worst. But instead of firing back, the driver lifts a white cloth from the window, an unmistakable sign of surrender. When the car stops, the soldiers are stunned. Stepping out is none other than Hermann, one of Hitler's most powerful and feared deputies. Without hesitation or shame, he calmly requests help with his luggage, as if he were checking into a hotel instead of giving himself up at the end of a global war. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Washington, D.C., Supreme Court Justice Jackson receives word that Hermann has been captured alive in Austria. Some officials believe execution is the simplest solution, but Jackson has always opposed punishment without due process. He pushes for something unprecedented, to bring the remaining Nazi leaders to court and charge them with crimes against humanity. His secretary warns him that international law doesn't make this easy. No nation normally has the authority to judge another's people, and Germany itself is in a legal gray zone after the collapse of the Nazi regime. But Jackson is determined. If justice is going to mean anything, the Allies must work together. His first step: form a tribunal with judges from each Allied nation. Far away in Luxembourg, a U.S. Army psychiatrist named Douglas rides a train, passing the time by showing a simple magic trick to a young woman named Lydia. When the train arrives, Sergeant Howie picks him up and becomes his translator for the mission ahead. Douglas is brought to the Grand Hotel Mondorf, a luxurious building that now functions as a highly guarded prison for the remaining Nazi high command. Colonel Andrews, the officer in charge, explains that the Allies are still debating whether to place these men on trial. Until a decision is made, Douglas is there to monitor the prisoners' mental state, especially to prevent suicide. Several prisoners have already taken their own lives using hidden poison capsules, and losing any more could ruin the chance for justice. Their biggest concern is Hermann. When he was captured, he carried an unusually large amount of medication. He claims it's for his heart, but the dosage, 40 pills a day, immediately tells Douglas that Hermann is deeply dependent on them. Without even taking a moment to settle in, Douglas insists on meeting Hermann right away. Inside the barracks turned room, Hermann relaxes comfortably, reading as if he were on vacation rather than awaiting judgment. With Howie translating, Douglas begins his examination, checking Hermann's pulse, listening to his lungs, and quietly assessing the mind of a man who once stood beside Hitler himself. Hermann refuses to let go of his medication, insisting he lives with constant pain, an old wound from the First World War. Douglas calmly suggests that the best cure for a strained heart is getting rid of excess weight. The remark doesn't sit well with Hermann at all. As they step out of the room, Douglas quietly tells Howie that Hermann understood the insult before it was translated. That alone proves the man knows English far better than he pretends. Douglas continues his rounds, meeting other high-ranking prisoners. There's Dr. Lely, the architect of the Nazi slave labor system, who insists he was never hungry for power like the rest. Then the Grand Admiral, furious about being held for 76 days without being officially charged, ranting that his treatment breaks the Geneva Convention. And Julius, the propaganda mastermind, who immediately asks Douglas if he is Jewish. When Douglas says no, Julius smugly replies that Douglas still works in a Jewish profession, revealing how deeply his ideology runs. Back in his room, Hermann begins dieting and exercising, no longer begging for his pills. Douglas notices the shift and scribbles everything into his journal. One realization becomes clear. Hermann acts as the glue that holds all these men together. A new idea sparks. Douglas asks Howie to accompany him to the library. Soon, the two of them are pushing a wheelbarrow stacked with biographies, political reports, and psychological studies on the Nazi leadership. Douglas believes that if he understands their pasts, he can break through their stubborn armor, maybe even uncover what twists a human mind towards such cruelty. And if he can publish those findings someday, it might save others from repeating history. But their research is interrupted. A guard rushes over with urgent news. Hermann is struggling to breathe. Douglas sprints to the room. One look at Hermann's face is enough. He's in the middle of a heart attack. Douglas orders common aspirin and carefully guides Hermann through slow breathing to calm him down. Hermann desperately reaches for a photograph of his wife, so Douglas hands it to him without hesitation. When the aspirin arrives, Hermann refuses to trust it. Douglas tastes it first to show it's safe. Only then does Hermann swallow it. By the time the medical officer arrives, the worst is past, and Hermann even manages a small smile. For the first time, he thanks Douglas in clear English. Meanwhile, in Washington, Justice Jackson receives word that all Allied nations agree to join the tribunal he proposed. But the celebration doesn't last long. Ammons, a military lawyer, brings a warning. Many leaders want the trial over quickly because they prefer execution, not legal arguments. Some officials doubt the trial will happen at all. Back in the hotel prison, Douglas conducts Rorschach tests with the inmates, promising complete confidentiality. Hermann is warm and cooperative, speaking English openly now. Julius, however, treats every ink blot as a crude joke, comparing each one to a woman's body. That evening, Jackson learns another heavy truth. Congress is firmly against a trial. They want swift punishment. The president refuses to take a stand, knowing he doesn't have Congress backing him. Jackson realizes he needs support from someone even more influential than the president himself. The following morning, Justice Jackson travels with Ammons to the Vatican, hoping to gain the support of the most influential spiritual leader in the world. Inside the quiet halls, they meet the Pope. Their conversation begins politely, touching on ideals of justice and morality. But when Jackson asks for public backing, the Pope gently refuses. Jackson doesn't let it end there. He brings up a painful truth. The Church once signed an agreement with Hitler before the war. The Pope explains it was done to shield German Catholics from persecution. Jackson counters that the document unintentionally gave the Nazis legitimacy, and history will remember it that way. The weight of Jackson's words hangs in the air. After a long pause, the Pope finally agrees to support the Allied plan for a public trial. Meanwhile, far from Vatican City, Douglas and Howie escort the captured Nazi officials aboard a transport plane. They inform the prisoners that they will indeed face a full court trial. Hermann, ever curious, asks what Douglas discovered about him through the inkblot test. Douglas responds. Hermann is sharp, deeply self-absorbed, and possessed by a hunger to dominate others. Hermann calmly replies that none of this is new to him. Then, with a strange smile, he asks Douglas to show another magic trick. Douglas makes a coin vanish into thin air, and Hermann boasts that one day he'll perform his own trick, escaping death when the gallows come for him. As the aircraft passes over shattered government buildings below, the prisoners stare in disbelief. They had once worked in these places. Now they lie in ruins under Allied bombs. Among the destroyed structures stands the former Palace of Justice. Jackson tells Ammons they will rebuild a courtroom big enough to hold 600 people. The pressure mounts when a British assistant prosecutor, Fay, warns Jackson that anything short of absolute victory will be viewed as complete failure. Later that day, the prisoners are taken to a fortress-like facility in Nuremberg. Colonel Andrews details the extreme security measures. Mattresses filled with straw instead of springs, cardboard desks, beds bolted to the floor, chairs removed at night, and prisoners required to sleep with hands visible above the blankets to prevent suicide attempts. Dr. Lully breaks down at the sight of his cramped, filthy cell, but Hermann looks around with interest, admiring the efficiency of the setup. He reminds Douglas that no one has ever defeated him. He surrendered by choice, and he believes he is exactly where he intends to be. Douglas is puzzled. With every passing day, Hermann seems more confident, not less. Determined to understand him, Douglas remembers another powerful figure held in the same prison, Rudolf, Hitler's former deputy. Rudolf had even performed a forbidden Nazi salute when Hermann arrived, infuriating Colonel Andrews. Douglas realizes that if he wants to get closer to Hermann, Rudolf may hold the key. Rudolf, once one of the highest-ranking men in Hitler's circle, had a strange history. During the war, he survived a mysterious plane crash in England and spent days talking to influential British figures. But whenever questions grew difficult, he would suddenly claim he couldn't remember anything. His amnesia appeared and vanished whenever convenient, making nearly everyone suspect he was acting. Douglas decides to use this inconsistency to his advantage. He approaches Hermann and asks if he can provide anything. Stories, details, habits that might expose Rudolf's lies. Hermann agrees, but not for free. In return, he wants Douglas to deliver letters to his missing wife and daughter. Ever since his surrender, he has had no word from them. Later, Hermann is given permission to speak with Rudolf face to face. Rudolf stares blankly and pretends not to recognize him. But once they're alone again, Hermann quietly tells Douglas the truth. Rudolf is pretending. The moment Hermann arrived at the prison, Rudolf gave him the Nazi salute, something no man would do for a stranger. A few days later, Douglas and Howie manage to track down Hermann's wife, Emmy, and his daughter. The moment they hand over the letters, the girl throws her arms around Douglas in gratitude. The emotion of the moment weighs heavily on him. Moved by their situation, Douglas agrees to carry Emmy's own letter back to Hermann, even though it risks breaking protocol. When they return to Nuremberg, chaos is waiting for them. Crowds of reporters surround the prison entrance, shouting questions and flashing cameras. Colonel Andrews tells them why. News has leaked that the Nazi leadership is about to be formally charged. Douglas and Howie push through the noise and make their way to Hermann's cell. The guards stand at attention as they read the list of accusations aloud. Crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and participation in a vast conspiracy. The moment marks the official beginning of the reckoning the world has been waiting for. After informing Hermann of his charges, the officials move on to the next cells. Julius listens to the accusations with an unsettling calm and immediately demands a Jewish attorney, an obvious attempt to provoke everyone present. When it's Dr. Lely's turn, he completely loses control. He insists he never personally killed anyone and begins shouting in fear. Douglas tries to ease him down, but Lely suddenly lashes out and punches him in the face. Guards rush in, pinning Lely against the wall. In his panic, Lely drops his usual act and pleads, in perfect English, for someone to end his life. His desperation shocks even the soldiers. Shaken, Douglas later slips into a nearby bar, hoping to clear his head. There, he unexpectedly runs into Leia, the woman from the train. This time, he learns she's a journalist assigned to cover the coming trials. She warns him that Nuremberg is about to transform into a spectacle for the whole world. Returning to the prison that night, Douglas hands Hermann the letter from his wife. The moment is quiet, almost intimate, despite everything Hermann represents. Meanwhile, newspapers and radio broadcasts buzz with anticipation. Reporters describe how the devastated courthouse is being rebuilt for the historic event. A hidden tunnel will move the defendants from their cells to the courtroom, and the lighting for the film crews will be so intense that spectators may need sunglasses. The world is preparing to witness justice live. While Jackson organizes the prosecution's case, a serious complication arises. German officials intend to argue that their 1940 attack on Denmark and Norway was an act of self-defense, claiming Britain had planned to invade Norway first. If Germany can produce evidence of this, it could weaken the Allies' argument. But so far, no documents have surfaced. This revelation makes the legal team realize something urgent. They must learn what information the Nazis still hold, or else risk being blindsided during the trial. That night, Jackson meets with Douglas in secret. He asks him directly to gather intelligence from the prisoners. Douglas hesitates. Doing so would break doctor-patient confidentiality. Jackson counters that Douglas is already writing psychological reports that bend that boundary. Douglas finally asks what many have wondered. Why not just execute them? Jackson answers quietly, because killing them outright would turn them into martyrs. Putting them on trial shows the world what they truly are. Back inside the prison, Douglas sits with Hermann. offering him a cigarette to break the tension between them. He brings up the subject everyone avoids, Hitler. Hermann leans back and speaks with rehearsed confidence. According to them, Hitler revived their sense of national pride, promising to restore Germany to a greatness it had lost. When Douglas presses him about the concentration camps, Hermann insists they were intended only for labor, not death. Any horrors that occurred, he claims, were the responsibility of others. Yet, despite all his excuses, Hermann refuses to utter a single criticism of Hitler himself. The next morning, Douglas shares his observations with Jackson. He explains that Hermann knows exactly how to appear sympathetic, how to spin his actions into something almost reasonable. Ammons immediately lashes out, accusing Douglas of defending a monster. The two argue until Douglas clarifies that he isn't taking sides. His job is to understand Hermann's mind, not excuse it. Douglas explains his conclusion. Hermann never seemed personally obsessed with killing Jews, but he also didn't care enough to stop it. His loyalty was only to Germany's power, nothing else. Jackson is doubtful of Hermann's story as well, but Douglas warns him that assumptions won't stand in court. If you go in thinking you already know everything, he says, Hermann will tear your case apart. Later, Douglas visits Lely. The man apologizes quietly for attacking him earlier and confesses that he has begun planning his legal defense. For the first time, Douglas feels Lely is opening up to him. But only hours later, the alarms scream through the prison. Douglas sprints to Lely's cell, only to find he's too late. Lely has taken his own life, using a strip torn from his towel as a noose and stuffing his underwear into his mouth to keep himself from making noise. Colonel Andrews is furious, with tensions rising. He announces he has hired a second doctor to double-check Douglas's evaluations. During their next conversation, Douglas asks Hermann what he thinks about suicide. Hermann dismisses it as an act of weakness. He studies Douglas's face and immediately senses his unease. With a disturbing calm, he warns Douglas to be careful. Allies are not always loyal, and danger can come from the people standing beside you. To make his point, Hermann tells a grim story. His father's closest friend was a Jewish man who secretly abused Hermann's mother for years. The betrayal, he says, taught him long ago that trust is a luxury no one can afford. As the days roll on, Dr. Gilbert finally arrives to check the reports Douglas has been filing. After reviewing everything, Gilbert becomes convinced that Rudolph's memory loss is real. He even suggests co-authoring a book about the case. But Douglas turns him down immediately. Time keeps moving, and Douglas continues questioning the prisoners, passing every detail to Jackson. Whenever he can, he sneaks out to visit Hermann's family, often cheering up little Ada with simple magic tricks. When Douglas brings Hermann a bundle of new letters from home, Hermann is amazed and even asks if Douglas can teach him one of the tricks so he can impress his daughter someday. Howie eventually notices that Douglas keeps meeting Hermann alone and grows wary, but Douglas brushes off his concerns. The night before the trial begins, Douglas quietly asks Hermann what his defense will be. Hermann wonders if the question is being asked as an investigator or a friend. When Douglas says a friend, Hermann finally explains his plan. He'll accept responsibility for the things he truly did, but he won't take the blame for crimes committed by others behind his back. Douglas later passes this strategy to Jackson. When the morning arrives, the prisoners are escorted through an underground tunnel to the courthouse. Along the way, Hermann casually chats in German with the others. Inside, Jackson delivers a powerful opening speech, broadcast live over the radio. Hermann asks to give an opening statement of his own, but the judges refuse and simply demand his plea. He answers, not guilty, but in German. That evening, Douglas heads to see Hermann's family, only to find their furniture dumped outside, smashed and scattered. A neighbor reveals the truth. American forces took them away. Shocked, Douglas races to Andrew for answers. After a few calls, Andrew discovers that Emmy has been arrested on suspicion of helping Hermann steal artwork during the war, and Ada has been placed in a convent with zero visitation allowed. When Andrew asks how Douglas even knew where they were hiding, Douglas avoids the question. The next time Douglas visits Hermann, he lies and says his family is safe. Gilbert suddenly interrupts and exposes the truth. Furious, Douglas follows Gilbert into the hall and attacks him, forcing the guards to break up the fight. Andrew scolds them both for acting like children. The trial continues the next day, and Jackson unveils new footage the world has never seen. The film documents the liberation of the concentration camps by Allied forces, the mountains of corpses, the skeletal survivors battling starvation and disease, and the testimonies of the few who still had the strength to speak. Stomachs tattooed with numbers. Factories turned into crematoriums capable of burning hundreds of bodies in a single shift. It's all there, horrifying and undeniable. Hermann can't bear to look anymore. He puts on dark glasses and headphones to block it all out. Meanwhile, Douglas, shaken to his core, quietly steps away, barely holding himself together. When Hermann is escorted back to his cell, Douglas is already waiting for him, furious and shaken. He demands to know how Hermann could possibly claim ignorance about the horrors shown in the footage. Hermann coldly insists the film was a fabrication. Then he throws an accusation back at Douglas, calling him a hypocrite, pointing out that America dropped bombs that killed thousands in Japan. That's when Douglas finally snaps, shouting that there's a vast difference between the casualties of war and the mass extermination of an entire people. Their argument grows heated, each pushing the other's breaking point, until Douglas finally storms out, leaving Hermann with a brutal reminder that his decisions have already torn his family apart. Later that night, Douglas drowns his anger in a bar. Leia finds him in his vulnerable state and skillfully coaxes him into talking more than he should. The very next morning, the consequences arrive. Newspapers publish details of his private conversations with Hermann. Andrews, furious at the breach, fires him on the spot. But before Douglas leaves, Andrews quietly reveals that he managed to get Emmy and little Ada released. At the train station, Douglas runs into Howie, who looks completely defeated. Overwhelmed, Howie finally shares the truth. He was born in Germany to Jewish parents. He and his sister barely escaped the country with a few coins to their name, while their parents were murdered by the Nazis. Through tears, he begs Douglas to do something, anything, that might help secure justice against Hermann. But Douglas insists he's only a psychiatrist, nothing more. Before walking away, Howie leaves Douglas with a haunting reminder. The Holocaust happened because too many people stayed silent until it was too late. Something breaks inside Douglas. Moments later, he storms into Jackson's office and announces that the entire trial is being played right into Hermann's hands. Hermann surrendered willingly because he wants the witness stand. He wants a stage to rewrite history and polish Hitler's image for the world to hear. Douglas believes Jackson can't defeat him with ordinary strategy. So he hands over his notebook, filled with confidential conversations, observations, private remarks, and all the off-record details Hermann never expected to be used. He explains that the real weakness Hermann carries isn't guilt, it's pride. Vanity is the key. Douglas chooses to stay in Germany as a civilian spectator. The next morning, Hermann is called to the stand. He walks in confidently, striking heroic poses for the photographers, as though he's the star of the show. Jackson begins questioning him. Hermann calmly insists that the camps were simply labor centers meant to protect Germany, and claims he had no knowledge of what the guards were doing inside. But among the evidence lies a chilling document, bearing Hermann's own signature, supporting a plan known as the Final Solution, an order that called for the systematic annihilation of the Jewish people. Hermann tries to defend himself by claiming the document was simply misunderstood, that he had only approved the removal of Jews from German territory, not their extermination. His explanation pushes Jackson to the edge of his patience. He snaps, raising his voice, and the judges immediately reprimand him for losing control. Realizing he's getting nowhere, Jackson is forced to step back. At that moment, Faye steps in to continue the questioning. He calmly reminds the court that throughout the entire war, Hermann remained second in command, never once losing favor. Then he asks the question everyone has avoided. Do you still stand with your leader? Hermann doesn't hesitate. He openly declares his loyalty, even repeating Hitler's salute. In that single moment, whatever credibility he had left collapses. Jackson, Faye, Howie, and Andrews later thanked Douglas, acknowledging that the insights he provided were exactly what they needed to expose Hermann's true nature. That evening, Douglas returns to Hermann's cell. He admits he violated confidentiality for the sake of justice and tells Hermann this will be their last conversation. The next morning, Douglas boards a train and finally leaves Germany behind. Meanwhile, the tribunal announces its judgment. Hermann and the other high-ranking Nazis are condemned to death by hanging. Their execution is scheduled for midnight, but the prisoners won't learn the exact time until an hour beforehand. Anyone requesting a sedative will be given nothing more than a harmless placebo. As Andrews briefs reporters from the Allied nations about how the final hours will unfold, something unexpected happens inside the prison. Hermann performs the same magic trick Douglas once taught him. Only this time, it reveals he had hidden a poison capsule all along. The alarm blares through the corridors. By the time Andrews reaches the cell, Hermann lies lifeless. He has taken his own way out of the sentence. While all this is happening, Julius reaches his breaking point. Terrified and shaking, he refuses to move until Howie steps in. With surprising gentleness, Howie helps him dress and walks him toward the execution chamber. Julius tries to shout a few bold phrases in German, as if he's unafraid, but the act doesn't last. Moments before the noose is placed around his neck, he breaks down in tears. When the lever is pulled, fear overtakes him so completely that he loses control of his body in his final moments. Across the night, each of the condemned men meets the same fate, one after another, silence replacing their defiance. In the months that follow, Douglas attempts to process everything he witnessed. He writes a book about his experiences, hoping the world will understand the deeper message he discovered. The seeds of the same hatred he saw in the Nazis can grow anywhere, even in the country he calls home. But the world isn't ready to listen. Interviewers dismiss him, audiences mock him, and the warnings he tries to give fall on deaf ears. Overwhelmed by the memories and consumed by alcohol, Douglas eventually turns to the very poison Hermann once hid and ends his life the same way. Howie, unable to stay in the military after everything he lived through, returns to America. There, he reunites with his sister and finally begins to build a peaceful life. Jackson goes back to the Supreme Court, where his work on the trials becomes the foundation for modern international law. His efforts shape the way war crimes are prosecuted for generations to come. And that brings us to the end of this powerful story. If you enjoyed this recap and want more breakdowns just like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, leave a like, and share the video with your friends. Your support helps Starz Recapped keep bringing you the best movie explanations from around the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.